So a couple admissions here. I think this research is different than I come from an advocacy organization. I do have a PhD. I am trained as a researcher, but this is for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. You won't be surprised that the findings I show are supportive of historic preservation, but I don't come from a preservation background myself. I sort of see the logic of it now that I've done the research as sort of a mercenary, but it's still, don't ask me preservation questions because I'll look at you blankly. It's not really about this is the future of retail panel. I think we could probably draw something out from what I say about the future of retail, the future of Main Street. It's not entirely about non-chains. Emily put me up for that. Yeah. I have things to say about non-chains, but, and then, I think all the theoretical or conceptual approaches that have been talked about recently, mine's pretty atheoretical and really focused on the built environment. At the exclusion of some other important things, probably. So I'll get into it. So I come from the National Trust, from our Research and Policy Lab team, until recently called the Preservation Green Lab. The National Trust is a pretty big nonprofit. The Research and Policy Lab team is 4 of us currently, across an organization of about 350. And people think of the National Trust, they think of historic preservation, you think of architecturally or historically significant buildings. Our work is really about all existing buildings, older buildings generally, and oftentimes we actually work with the development community to talk about new development and how that can fit alongside the old. So we are not the typical preservation kind of group. So conservation, reuse, retrofit. And I would say our orientation is really about what preservation as a means to economic development ends, community development ends, et cetera. So not preservation for preservation's sake, but rather for all these sort of good planning kind of outcomes. I always have to show, so we're probably best known as a team, formerly as the Preservation Green Lab, for this research, the Greenest Building Report. There's an architect named Carlo Elefante who said the greenest building is one that already exists, and our first big research report put out in 2012 quantified the environmental value of building reuse and showed that it makes a lot of sense if you're planning on demolishing a building and building something of the same size, which is quite a condition there, conditional. Even if it's a LEED certified quality building, you're likely to have greater environmental impact that way than reusing what's there, which makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of what I say makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to show you any wild hypotheses here. And then Jane Jacobs, we've talked a lot about Jane Jacobs. She's central to, I think, this topic. Of course, she said cities need old buildings so badly it's probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them in the death and life of great American cities. But preservationists, I think, until recently hadn't really grappled with her ideas or thought about that, at least, to my knowledge. So we did this research that I'm going to talk about these 2 reports, Older, Smaller, Better, which came out in 2014, and then this Atlas of Reurbanism, which is an invented word, but we're rolling with it, reurbanism. I would not encourage everyone else to use the word reurbanism. Also, Older, Smaller, Better was really about testing Jane Jacobs' ideas that you have to have, a good number of aged, or I don't know if she meant aged buildings, a mix of old and new buildings. You have to have buildings of various sizes, so small buildings. So we tried to take a very un-Jacobsian approach and brought a whole bunch of data to this question to see to what extent it was true across Seattle, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. And we used data from a whole bunch of different sources, including this really pixelated map showing intensity of cell phone activity on a Friday in Seattle. So where the pink is brightest, that's the greatest intensity of cell phone activity at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. Turns out there's more of that where there's a mix of old and new buildings. I'll get into all that. So that's the spot rank data. We used Yelp and Flickr and Craigslist and WalkScore. We used a lot of data from the ACS and from the census, from the LEHD, the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Survey, city permit data, a whole bunch of different stuff. And we aggregate that to a grid that we overlay, a lattice grid. Some people use hexagons. More recently, we used squares back in 2014. 200 meter by 200 meter grid, about 10,000 squares in the city of Seattle. In Older, Smaller, Better, we looked only at mixed use and commercial areas. That's about a quarter of that, about 25% of the city. For each of these 10,000 grid squares, we could say a lot of things. Importantly, the median age of structure, the diversity, the mix of old and new, and the granularity, or sort of the smallness of the built fabric. We could also say things about the job characteristics from that LEHD data, about the population characteristics from the census, about cultural uses from a cultural space inventory in Seattle, a bunch of different stuff. So just to give you a sense of this, it's maybe obvious, but just in case it's not, here's Seattle. Here are all the parcel polygons and the year built information for those, where the hot colors indicate older and the cool colors indicate newer. So you can see the stadia down there, downtown. You can see some trends pop up, especially as we look at the grid squares overlaid. So the red squares are the older areas in the cities. This is Pike Pine Corridor and Pioneer Square, or Pike Place, International District, and Pioneer Square. Generally maps up, if you know Seattle at all, with what you see, with what you experience when you're there. So the data in Seattle at least seems to be generally accurate. Some cities it's less accurate, looking at Philadelphia. So we take we normalize for the city overall. So the red is the oldest. The oldest in Seattle is very different than the oldest in Philadelphia or St. Louis. The red here is the greatest mix of old and new, these cool pixelated maps. So yeah, blue is age homogeneous, red is age diverse. Granularity, it's the number of, we actually can split up the buildings or the parcels, the count of buildings or parcels in a square, roughly density of buildings. But the smallness, I was saying yesterday to Folly that I think density of doorways is always my dream of doing that as a measure, but couldn't do it at this scale. And then we combine those, we normalize them for the city, we z-standardize them statistically, we add them together, we have this simple measure that's the character score. I don't really love that name either, but we're sticking with it. So the red in the last map here, which here's San Francisco for another example. The red is the oldest, the older, smaller, and the mixed age built environment. The blue is usually newer, larger buildings that are built around the same time. So downtown's financial district and San Francisco is blue. Downtowns tend to be lower character scores. There's sort of an ecological zone thing happening in a lot of these maps, which I don't know, it's accurate, I suppose. In these models that I'm going to show the results from, we did look at private investment. We looked at construction permit dollars and aggregated that to the grid square. We accounted for access to transit using the transit score from walk score, and we counted for income. And we found a lot of findings that I think people intuit. We found that where you have this kind of built environment, you have greater walkability. That's a duh finding. These buildings came up before cars were ubiquitous. Found younger residents and a greater mix of young and old people. A lot of people will say that, we used to kind of cutely say that young people love old buildings. I think the National Trust loves that line. I think a lot of people will say they love the low rents, not the old buildings, but we'll take that too. If older is more affordable with the housing filtering. We find greater nightlife using that cell phone measure. We isolate 10 o'clock on a Friday night, look across these 10 cities where you have old and new together on the same block. You have greater cell phone activity, and presumably not two cell phones on one body. Where there's more cell phones, there's more people. Greater cultural vitality, we used a bunch of different metrics, including permits pulled for cafe seating outside coffee shops, restaurants. More of those where you have that kind of built environment. More jobs, creative jobs, and businesses per square foot. And the per square foot measure is important. So we're accounting for the height of buildings. Generally, downtown towers are definitely going to have more jobs across the board than 3 or 4 floor buildings like in Pioneer Square here. But on a per square foot basis, there's a greater sort of hub or hive of activity. There's a lot going on in these buildings and in these blocks. And then more women and minority-owned businesses, non-chain businesses, small businesses, and new businesses. So more jobs in small businesses in San Francisco, about 44.5% on average in the high character score versus about 34 and a third in the newer, larger, statistically significant. More than twice the rate of women and minority ownership in Seattle. makes sense when you think about all the things we've heard today, including, Vikas's presentation, I think really nailed a lot of this stuff. Local ownership means relationships with entrepreneurs or with proprietors, and usually that means not the same kinds of chains, not the same kinds of business ownership. And more non-chain establishments. So in DC, I was kind of struck by the numbers. If you look at non-chain, are always much higher than I think we assume they're going to be. I think we tend to see the same chains over and over again and imagine them as ubiquitous, but they're actually fewer in number. So yeah, in Washington, D.C., it was about 91% in the high character score areas versus about 78.5%. So both high on both sides there. And I should qualify some of this stuff. So we used small businesses here. We used that LAHD data from the census. So we used businesses with fewer than 20 employees. Women and minority ownership, we used data in this study from this really crummy data set. We used the Office of Economic Development kind of procurement. They're registered databases for women and minority-owned businesses. There's a lot you could say about why that's not a great data set. We've used Dun & Bradstreet in some newer work. And the non-chain, we actually took the names. We actually scraped Yelp for the data in this study, and we compare the names to the names of all the top chains using like the National Retail Federation and some other chain listings, and just kind of cross those off the list and counted them up. Pretty simple. So since that report came out in 2014, I worked with Emily on an article that was published in the Journal of the American Planning Association. I think that was 2017, maybe 16. We've done a lot of the same. We've taken that mapping and rolled it out to a whole bunch of different cities. So Tucson, Philadelphia, this is Jacksonville, Florida, I think. This is Chicago. We've actually tried doing this opportunities for reuse, opportunity analysis, working with the Urban Land Institute in a bunch of different cities. I can talk about that more if you guys are interested. But what I think is more interesting or pertinent to this conversation, to this topic today, so we took older, smaller, better, and we said, well, now that we're good at this, and now that we're using Postgres instead of aggregating data painfully in Esri software, let's go big. So we built a 50-city database for this Atlas of Reurbanism project. Cities from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon. We have Anchorage, Alaska, and Honolulu. Got a lot of the U.S. Not necessarily the 50 biggest cities, but 50. And we built more data into this. So we have this summary report online. It's got some summary statistics. I love this chart. It's my favorite chart ever. This is the basically era of construction across these 50 cities, where red is pre-1920, gold goes up to 1945, light blue is up to 1967. Dark blue is after 1967. It's pretty cool, pretty mind-blowing, something to spend a lot of time with. Harder to look at in a PowerPoint. I apologize for that. Trying to get 50 lines there is tricky. Chicago is right here. So Chicago's it's up there in terms of pre-45 and pre-20. Yeah. There's definitely some garbage in the data. So I was saying to someone last night, Philadelphia's data says that 20% of Philadelphia was built in the year 1925. And so that actually really distorts a lot. And there was an argument. Went to a symposium like this at Columbia University, and there was a fight over year built as a data point, with Pluto in particular. The historic preservation folks hate it. But, it's something. It's not entirely wrong. We don't think it's totally random, although people at Columbia argue otherwise somewhat. So we have interactive maps, and I'm not going to show those. We have fact sheets for each of these 50 cities you can download. We kind of hope these would be something that people could bring to a planning commission or a city council or a mayor. So it's got a few facts about the city along with this sort of dashboard. Right now our mapping's real clunky, but we're hoping to build out something that's a lot more useful and functional. So this is stuff I've shown before. Every time I present, I like to show something different. And this is where the presentation's going to kind of go off the rails a little bit and get interesting, which I hope you'll be okay with. And Luke, I noted when you said things are not the same everywhere yesterday, such a simple, true statement. So I'm going to show you 50 cities worth of and I don't have any explanations or theories quite yet of why these things are significant in some cities and not others. But that's for us to think about together. So 50 cities worth of data. I ran the character score as a linear regression with count of jobs with a bunch of measures, but here's count of jobs in small businesses, where gray means it's not significant, blue means it's significant in the positive direction, and red means significant in the negative direction. So jobs in small businesses. So this, I'll take an example just to kind of test the case because I'm going to show several of these. So in Phoenix, where you have older, smaller buildings and mixed age buildings on basically on a block on a 200 meter by 200 meter grid square, you see significantly greater counts of jobs in small businesses. And this is aggregate, this is not per square foot. So it's striking to see Chicago, LA, Miami, and Pittsburgh as the 4 outliers. This is the game we play and trying to think through why those cities would be different. And I don't think I have a theory yet what binds Chicago, LA, Miami, and Pittsburgh. But there's going to be some interesting stuff in these slides. So percent of jobs in small businesses, Jane Jacobs was not wrong. And I think a lot of the presentations we've heard, clearly there's a link between the built environment and the proportion of jobs that are in small businesses. A granular built environment produces or is associated with, depending on how far you want to stretch the statistics in terms of causality, a more granular economic environment. And I think that's stands up for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to go to causality. I shouldn't have even stepped into that. Number of jobs in new businesses in 2014. Again, this is a peculiar set of cities. Here I start to look at this list of the cities in red because I'm looking at the outliers or the oddities. And I would think that Miami, Honolulu, and Virginia Beach are 3 cities, and Houston, that are all relatively new. But again, or there's something sprawling happening with some of those at the top. Can't really begin to get into that. But as a proportion, again, with new businesses, only Detroit is the negative. And I think I have the count somewhere here. It's like 30 cities significant in the positive direction. Detroit does make sense to me here, having spent a lot of time there recently, that new businesses are generally downtown and in midtown. That seems to be where a lot of the activity is happening, and those are relatively new buildings. Detroit, only 5%. Thank you, Emily. Only 5% younger than 50 years old buildings. Jobs in retail industry. This is the striking thing. So it just is not the same relationship. I really thought that high character score areas, that smaller, older, smaller, mixed vintage was going to be associated with more retail, and certainly not as an aggregate. I don't know if it's malls, and as a percentage, generally the same pattern. So you'd think that, I would think that where you see this kind of environment, this sort of the traditional Main Street, I guess, but these might be peculiar kind of places that are of interest to visitors and things like that. Count of businesses, this is aggregate, again, not square foot, but women and minority owned, we start to see a relationship that looks more comforting to a preservationist, probably. Percent women or minority owned, very much so. So, and then I thought, just quickly, I thought that maybe this was a phenomenon. We weren't seeing retail show up because there was a loss, because of the retail apocalypse, quote unquote. And the findings are just really mixed if you look at the coefficients across those 50 models. Some cities gained a stronger relationship there. A lot of cities got weaker. There's the top 5 and bottom 5 if you're interested. And then the takeaways. I think commercial districts of this kind of built environment are really important. I think the discussion a little bit earlier with Vikas about what this means, like how can you kind of build upon this is a challenge. I think probably we could be mapping vacant, older, smaller, mixed vintage, or vacant, older, smaller for sure, and looking for opportunities there. The link to retail, it's just way more. I did that just for this meeting. Really was surprised by that. And then the next study we're currently working on residential affordability and risk of displacement in historically African American neighborhoods in 10 cities. This is a study that's going to come out early next year. We're well on the way with that. We're really hoping to do a commercial slice of this, maybe looking at just 1 city or 2 cities. So that's something I was looking forward to this meeting to get a lot of ideas about, and I've been taking a lot of notes. So that's my presentation. And one more. Heather, let's go.